right, here we are. We're still in Montreal, Quebec, with our interviews, and we're going to continue having conversations, Alberta, because again, we want to expand your idea of what sovereignty could look like, separation, independence, and we're going to take a geopolitical look this time. We have Matthew Ehret, who's a geopolitical commentator and a historian, and pick up his books if you get a chance. Check those out, because what we want to do now is dig into a bit of the history of Alberta, Quebec, the separation, independence, and then zoom out a bit on a geopolitical stage to see what kind of impact would it be if Alberta does separate or maybe run into a no result. So thank you very much, Matt, for joining us today.
Hey, thank you for having me on, Jason.
It's a pleasure, son. Now I'm in your city.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, last time I met you or saw you, you were out in Alberta at the Sean Newman podcast event.
Yeah, the Cornerstone.
And you spoke there.
Yes.
So what brought you out to Alberta to speak to us?
Well, I've got a lot of friends. The last year or so, I've been making periodic journeys and just getting a feel for the various independence leaders and what is this movement exactly. So I wanted to break out of the theory and get a little bit more visceral of a sense of, is this a viable movement and what exactly is it? So now that I have a better sense, I've got more certainty when I speak about what the future of Canada, of Alberta should be, also specifically how that impacts Quebec. So I just actually came back from last week. I was invited to speak at a United Conservative Party sponsored event as well. It was the MLA one of the MLAs there, who's very friendly to the concept of independence, invited a few speakers to also just showcase what are the opportunities for Alberta, and also what specifically does Carney intend for Canada and for the world at large. So what is his role within a broader system? And so since I have a bit more of a reputation as speaking more about global contexts, my job was to just talk about what does he want for Canada, and does that really favor Albertans, without necessarily enforcing whether or not the Albertans should necessarily go independent or simply use their constitutional rights that are embedded within the BNA Act in order to force a renegotiation of some of the unjust, unfair arrangements that are currently in play. So I tried to do a good job there.
You did a fantastic history presentation. I was blown away when you were there at the Sean Newman event. And I'm not surprised that you got invited to a UCP event with, there's a lot of friendly MLAs on this subject. Eric Bouchard comes to mind.
Eric Bouchard is the man,
yeah. Yeah, I'm not surprised. So you're down in the Calgary area likely doing some speaking?
Lougheed, yeah.
Absolutely. Because this isn't a new thing for Alberta, as you're very aware of. Mm-hmm. At least 40 plus years, there's been a strong movement. And it goes actually all the way back to 1905. Mm-hmm. You want to kind of remind Albertans, how did we join Canada and what brought us to the table?
Well, I wrote a series of books called The Untold History of Canada. And I think one of the important things that I encountered that I didn't expect to necessarily discover along my journey was that Canada itself has some very artificial roots. And it was unfortunate because I didn't go in there intending to prove that Canada is as a whole a synthetic pseudo-nation. However, that was what the evidence showed me, and I discovered that a big part of our history and why it is that Canada from 1865 or 1867, when our BNA Act was passed, only had 4 colonies that became sort of confederated, to becoming what it is known as today. How did that even happen? And a big part of that Go West strategy was geopolitically motivated by an attempt by the British Empire, which was still then, as I would say in many ways it still is today, shaping much of Canada's internal and foreign policy. They were petrified at the idea of losing the western part of then an isolated British Columbia. Much of today's Alberta was the Hudson Bay land. It was a private Rupert's Land area. And at the time, the Abraham Lincoln Republican movement in the United States that had just survived a very brutal civil war had a very strong, ambitious project to extend the newly created transcontinental railway upwards that had just been finished by 1869. And the idea was to extend that up through British Columbia, through the newly sold Alaska that the Russians had only just sold to the United States in 1867. And already negotiations between Tsar Alexander II and the Third's networks with the Lincoln Republicans. Lincoln had been killed then, but many of his allies were still alive, was already well underway to connect a rail line between a trans-Siberian railway through the Bering Strait, through Alaska, down through British Columbia to create a foundation of cooperation between a very robust anti-imperial America and a Russia that had just abolished serfdom and that had a very strong sense of needing to get over this system of British free trade, Hobbesian geopolitics that had driven forever wars for centuries before that. So there was this fear that this might happen, and Canada was seen as a very valuable piece of real estate to be created both as a geopolitical disruptive influence run by the monarchy, the Privy Council, and the entire shadow government, which is baked into our BNA Act. The idea was to use that instrument as a way to disrupt the United States at various times when the U.S. was becoming disobedient to certain edicts of the empire, and at the other hand, to create a wedge between a potential alliance economically between the Russians and the Americans, specifically over Arctic cooperation. So the race to, sell Rupert's Land to the federal government that was approved right at the same time, 1867 or 1869, the sale of Alaska, the idea of trying to force BC into Confederation, and then to ultimately try to carve out a country. Unfortunately, when you read the writings of people like John A. Macdonald, sort of the Canadian George Washington, he literally said that he would rather leave Canada a barren wasteland for generations, except that he knows that if he does not go there, then the Yankees certainly will. So it, I think, just showed that this idea of creating a Canadian manifest destiny to go west was too much motivated, although a lot of good came out of it. People found a pioneering spirit, which was great, but a lot of it was motivated top down by a geopolitical, very destructive idea to keep Canada a tool, an instrument of a global imperial strategy. So that's part of Alberta's history, unfortunately.
My goodness. So we've been a pawn for quite some time
Yeah.
in the geopolitical stage under the British Empire. So this might have been like a response to the U.S. becoming independent, expanding their borders as well, going west and then eventually northwest.
Sure.
So this was a way of stopping them on the geopolitical national stage.
Absolutely. Well, you had a lot of figures who were very much in favor of saving the Union amongst the Quebecois back then, the followers of Louis-Joseph Papineau and his nephew, Louis-Antoine Dessaulles. There was a network known as Les Rouges. There were Republicans who were in opposition to Confederation. Many of them recognized that Canada was being used as a Confederate intelligence hub, which is why John Wilkes Booth was up in Montreal being given orders, instructions, and probably some brainwashing to go down and murder Lincoln with a broader network. But that's what Canada was very much known for under the British system. Now, there were a lot of people who didn't like that, and they wanted Canada to become an independent country. On the federal level, we had Isaac Buchanan, a leading nation builder who was the head of the then Liberal Party, a very different thing than the thing it became later on after World War II. And Isaac Buchanan was another figure who was a major industrialist, a political power broker, who's been written out of our history mostly. And he was very much in favor of, one, keeping Canada neutral in the context of Britain's entry into the war, which Britain threatened to do with the French to support the Confederacy to break up the Union. So that was a major threat. That's why Tsar Alexander II even came down and ordered his own naval fleets to the coasts of America as a message to the European imperialists, saying that if you go to war to support the Confederates, that's going to be war with Russia, and that kept them at bay. But that being said, he had an idea, vision for an independent republic in Canada, and it was only through his two enemies, George Brown on the one hand, who ran the Globe, today's Globe and Mail, and John A. Macdonald, who is supposedly the enemy of George Brown, but in fact they both worked together to keep that type of discussion of a genuine republic in Canada that is industrial, that is sovereign, from being even permitted to be spoken in public society. So he was ousted by these two figures, and similarly the grouping around the Quebec Republicans, who had their own vision for an industrial Canada. Some of them wanted to join Lincoln's Union. I think at that time that might not have been a bad idea. But they were unfortunately, they also lost a few fights, and Confederation did go forward. And unfortunately, that held us back from, I think, a lot of higher development that could have happened for us if we took a wiser pathway.
Wow. So what could kind of look like if there was a big push out of Quebec for Republicans and actually joined the Union?
Well, I think that if you had a strong spirit, as we had seen back then, of things like a National People's Bank, which was something that we had seen even during the earlier rebellion of Lower and Upper Canada in 1837-38, there was actually a very strong concept of utilizing a national bank. Then in 1838, it was known as the National People's Bank, due to the fact that rebellion failed, due to the fact as well that many of those who were leading it were not aware of the nature of the British sophistication in infiltrating and bringing in agents provocateurs, other things that would destroy it from within very quickly. It lasted 2 seconds. So none of those ideas were really able to breathe. But if such a thing were available, and they were, I mean, I think that when you look at Elo David, Calixa Lavallee, even Wilfrid Laurier, who later became prime minister at the time, he was a Republican, an admirer of Lincoln. There was, I think, an idea of following the Lincoln strategy for utilizing a type of greenback, which would be a different type of currency than the one that we have that's run by the Federal Reserve or by the Bank of International Settlements in our day and age today, and even in Canada. It's the Bank of International Settlements that sets the monetary policy of what Canada is going to be allowed to do based upon creating ever-growing rates of national and other types of debts that will be used as the foundation of a monetary circulation without even creating real productive value that will, in a healthy society, you're like, okay, we'll take out a debt, but that debt should only be allowed if it's tied to activity that will pay off the debt. So build a project that will have more productive power, that'll increase the buying power of a dollar in the future. That will then exterminate the debt you took out in the present, like buying a tractor. If you're a farmer and you don't have a tractor, you might take out a debt. That's a good debt. But if you want to go and gamble at a casino or buy some drugs, that's a bad debt. Then we lost that sense of legit versus unlegit debt. But back then, there was a stronger idea. And I think that there was a great opportunity back then for either, as I said, there was 3 pathways. Either Canada becomes an independent country in the wake of the Civil War, or there was a big movement around William Seward, the Secretary of State of Lincoln, who had a big, a strong argument to acquire Canada, since Britain was caught red-handed funding the Confederacy, basically providing warships that the Confederacy was then using to destroy American naval ships. They were caught red-handed. They lost a court case in 1870, and what William Seward said is, well, look, instead of them giving us money, we don't need money. We need Canada. Canada's a dangerous British hub, and unfortunately, they went with money instead, so Britain kept control of Canada. And the other third option would have been maybe the Quebecois would be able to have their own country, but that was an opportunity missed back then, and it only came up again in the 1960s or 50s, but really 60s, which, again, didn't last very long.
Now, Canada had a bit of a rocky start, though. So we had Upper Canada, Lower Canada, and then there was a bit of a war there to kind of keep the Quebec, to keep the land known as Quebec today. Can you take us through that war?
Yeah, well, so a lot of history books today tend to teach these as 2 separate things, the Upper and Lower Canada rebellions, one led by William Lyon Mackenzie, a mayor of Toronto, who was a leader of the Upper Canada Rebellion, and Louis-Joseph Papineau, who was a leader of the Lower Canada Rebellion. In my assessment, that's a lie. That has disrupted our ability to learn properly about what were the developments and causes of what was going on then, such that we could learn from it today. Okay. Because you definitely, it wasn't a coincidence that both rebellions both emerged at the exact same time. It just doesn't work that way. There was communication, coordination. And unfortunately, at the time, they were both relying upon an America that ceased to exist at that moment that they chose to make the move that they did. So both of them realized that by themselves they couldn't do it. They required a strong Republican USA that was run by patriots who were very aware of the spirit of 1776. Now, unfortunately, back then, by this time, you had Martin Van Buren, who became the president of the United States and who actually passed a certain law or series of laws that made it illegal for Americans to support the Canadian Republicans. So without the support of a strong USA, they were left out to hang. There were some figures within Buffalo, within the northern parts of the U.S. that still had sympathy and provided monetary and military support and even advisory, some advisors. But they didn't know what they were doing, and they were just too little, too late. And I think another factor in what disrupted that in both cases was that William Lyon Mackenzie, who I think was a good man, and Papineau, they tried to pluck the fruit before it was ripe. So they were inspired by the effects of what Benjamin Franklin had been able to achieve 2 generations earlier in the American Revolution. But they didn't do what Ben Franklin did. They didn't have the patience of Franklin, who began his work in 1730, you could say, with his understanding that there was no way this new hellfire. Earlier on, Ben Franklin had hoped that the better England, the more legitimate England of Shakespeare and of Thomas More, would be something that could be revived as a noble force in the world. He had hoped that, perhaps with good reason. But by the 1720s, it became more apparent that a more Hellfire Club satanic agency that had taken control of British government and the entirety from the 1730s to the 1770s. Every leading member of the British executive branch of the government were members of the Hellfire Club itself, which was a satanic agency that you didn't want to necessarily run the world for you. So he began to work very early on to both infiltrate, to get intelligence back to the patriots of what was going on in England, as well as to set the stage for what would later become the revolution by his work on cultural education, creating leadership cadres that would be able to turn citizens, or basically create citizens where there were formerly subjects, and create leaders where there currently were none. And that took time. But that was vital when the time finally came to pluck the fruit. It was ripe. And he had the George Washingtons, he had the Jays, the Hamiltons, the Madisons, to carry on leadership positions. Whereas in the case of Canada, I think they jumped too quickly at the fruit. They didn't take the time to properly upgrade the cultural level, and they didn't appreciate the nefariousness of the John Russells out there who were in charge of infiltrating and destroying the thing from within. And I think that's been part of the anxiety of many of the independence-minded Canadians over the next 180 years, has been the fact that we live in such an unjust, fake system that looks on the surface to be very nice. But when you start scratching or try to make a just change of a systemic value, you discover very quickly that there's a darker force keeping a tight rein of control on. So I think people get a little overwhelmed sometimes by that fact, and then they move too quickly out of fear, out of rage, out of anxiety, and because you can't think in a creative state when you're in fear mode, a lot of good people have opened themselves up to be undermined, and we saw a lot of this even in the 60s, when there was a really robust move for independence, and it unfortunately was ill-managed and was infiltrated by FLQ terrorists pretty quickly, who began to quickly try to take control of what the Quebec independence voice was going to be. And they wanted something based upon mailbox bombs, getting violent, and trying to sort of do things that would turn the movement into a terrorist movement. Now, it was also not a surprise to discover, and Ben Trudeau, who's a strategic analyst in Alberta, who I've been speaking with for some time, he's pulled together a lot of very strong points of evidence to demonstrate that Pierre-Elliott Trudeau and a special branch within the RCMP were managing that entire radicalization and infiltration of the FLQ back in the 60s and 70s, which is, again, would tell you a lot about what's controlling the strategy behind the federal government today, which didn't change its modality over the next 50 years, because that gave rise to having tanks on the streets of Montreal, the entire October crisis of martial law. That was something that traumatized a lot of Quebec baby boomers, who still carry around some subconscious trauma from what they had to suffer from during that time when the residues of the leadership of the Quebec movement for independence was really clamped down on. Pierre Laporte, our deputy premier, was murdered in a similar manner that Aldo Moro, the prime minister of Italy, was killed just 4 years later by a similar project by the Red Brigades, another Gladio, NATO operation that was being done in Europe. Same thing as was being done by Pierre-Elliott Trudeau and his network in Canada. Same thing. So this has continued on to create things like the Islamic terror cells that tend to always have FBI handlers, CIA, RCMP handlers, and managers controlling these things to create a situation where, in the minds of Canadians or Americans, they're led to believe that they have to give up their freedoms in order to have security from terrorism, or right-wing terrorism that we found to actually be to have FBI signatures all over it, even in the United States. Or in Canada, where you have the Heritage Front, the one of the only white nationalist organizations we have in Canada. It was discovered openly, and mainstream media even had to cover this in 1997, that its founder and the guy who ran it, Grant Bristol, was a CSIS agent. So it's like this is still here today, and people have to be really aware of that. This is the sort of thing that they should expect if they're going to make a move, whether in Quebec, Saskatchewan, or Alberta. That this is everywhere.
Very good point, especially when you say that creativity gets extinguished when you have fear. And we see this basically everywhere. Whenever there's an uprising of any kind, peaceful, something like that comes along. Can you take us back to the Plains of Abraham?
It's not something I've done too much work on, but what I can say is that the consolidation of British imperial controls, like Britain came out of the 7 Years' War, which was, I think you could say, the First World War. All of the empires of the world were all enmeshed in this massive global war. And in Quebec, or in Canada, in North America, it manifested in you had the American Indian Wars, a variety of other things. Plains of Abraham being a big moment in that journey. But by 1763, you had Britain come out as the dominant force that took over control of most French territories of North America. The Acadians were expelled down to Louisiana and other things like that. But I think the idea of crushing the spirit of the Quebecois became very much on the forefront of the minds of the British grand strategists at that time, because the Quebecois had a lot of resentment, but they also had a strong Colbertist sort of foundation. So the Quebecois had a spirit that prized still the ideals of Mazarin and Colbert, the figures who gave rise to the founding of the modern nation state at the Treaty of Westphalia, just 80 years earlier. No, longer than that, 120 years earlier. And the idea of creating a society founded upon the idea that we're all made in the image of God, that was still strongly felt in the hearts of a lot of Quebecois. But the problem there was that the British were able to work with, because when the British came in, they brought in their Anglican sort of control mechanism, since the Anglican Church, which has the king as the head of the church instead of the Pope, has both a good side for the masses, but there's also something on the inside of that church which has been very useful for intelligence services over the centuries. And they began to work very closely with the Jesuits, that had been sort of the contaminating, corrupting influence within the Catholic Church since the Jesuits were created as an order in 1534. Well, they were created as the order in 1540, but they were created in 1534 when Loyola was studying at the University of Paris. Now, that 1534 was the same year that the Anglican Church was also created by Henry VIII. I don't think that that's a coincidence, especially when you look back at some of the figures who were shaping both of those agencies at that very same time, tied to Venice. And Webster Tarpley and a lot of the work from EIR researchers painted that picture very clearly in my mind, that these are two sides of the same agency. And in Quebec, they began to collaborate very closely, where the weak part of the French culture back then was the seigneurie system, and the lack of encouragement for the plebeians to be literate and to read high literature and to use their minds. Instead, the seigneurie system was the feudal system. And whereas in the English-speaking parts of the colonies of the Americas, there wasn't that problem. Culturally, they were much more advanced, much more literate. It was much more common to find farmers who could read Latin, read the Bible, read Shakespeare. And because of that, they could read and understand the ideas of Thomas Paine that were circulating to understand, why should I risk my life for the idea of freedom? Philosophically, it's very challenging. Whereas in the Quebec population, they didn't have that cognitive level of development, which was, again, exacerbated by the collusion of the Jesuits and the Anglicans, who said, okay, well, look, Ben Franklin is up here, because Franklin saw and recognized, coming out of the Plains of Abraham and the 7 Years' War, he saw that there was a lot of favor that the Quebecois felt to the cause of the Americans. And he said, well, why don't we just invite them to become the 14th colony, to say together with the other 13 that we're going to declare independence together and have a new type of country that rejects hereditary law and is based upon the idea of the consent of the governed. And Ben Franklin led a delegation, and he was up here in Montreal for about 5 weeks in 1776 in April. They even had open letters from the Continental Congress from 1774 to Quebec saying, hey, look, just come down. And they were really working hard, and the majority of Quebecois people wanted to, but the leadership, Bishop Briand at the time, who was positioned by the British to be the controller of the Quebec Church, basically said that, one, if you do that, if we allow a delegation to be sent, anybody who participates in that, or even who ends up joining Washington's army, will be excommunicated, meaning for a Catholic, that means you're going to burn in hellfire forever. So that was a disincentive for very many people to participate in Franklin's dream. And the other thing is the British also created what's known as the Quebec Act in 1774 as a way to bribe the Quebecois into accepting being subjugated under the British Crown, saying that the idea was, okay, we'll give you local controls. You could still be Catholic. You could still have local micro control over your your legislative assembly on a small little level, but you won't be able to control the big things. But you'll be able to control like the stop signs or whatever, right? Or like what type of shovels are used to shovel up the manure from the horses. You can control that, and we'll also expand the territory of Quebec all the way down to the Ohio River and encircle the colonies at the same time. And this became one of the intolerable acts. So the Quebecois, through the Jesuits and the Anglicans, as well as many native bands, have been manipulated, unfortunately, to think that their freedom would be located in remaining subjects instead of declaring themselves citizens. And I think that the British have been sort of laughing at us ever since.
A nation within a nation. But it's really interesting to know that Quebec, or lower Canada at the time, right?
Yeah.
Would have been the 14th colony. So there was a little push there for the 14th colony.
There was.
Things could have been a lot bit different. All right, so now that we know what Ben Franklin did, and we got to 1776, 13 colonies got together, independence, War of 1812 is next on the horizon. What happened there?
Well, that one is something I'm still exploring a little bit because there's a lot of misinformation and one of the problems with Quebec history research that I've encountered is that, they say the winners write the history.
Correct.
It's different from if you're an American historian. There's a lot more founding documents that have been preserved, in archivally speaking, original letters written by the good and the bad alike that have not been destroyed. In the case of Canada, it's a little bit different because the British have maintained a control. So because of that, there's been periodic purging and destruction of archival work, as we discovered in 2019 when I don't want to get away from your question, but I'm going to circle back to it. But in 2019, a lot of historians were excited to think that now they would finally get access to these dozens and dozens of boxes of RCMP files of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. But when they got there, because it was 20 years you have to wait from the point that somebody dies to when you can access them. But when all of these historians got to the archives of Canada, they were told that, this CSIS actually destroyed those boxes back in 1989. They didn't think that there was anything of interest in them, right? So there's nothing there. And the same thing happened when the Parliament building was burnt down in the 1840s in Quebec, in Montreal. It wasn't Ottawa back then, but rather Montreal that housed the National Parliament. That was also the house of the National Archives, of all of the original writings of Durham, of all of the leading figures of the Family Compact, and other things that did a lot of damage. And also a lot of good people had their archives there, and it burnt down to the ground, including all of the archives. So that's just two examples I'm just thinking of off the top of my head. But it does make it difficult to find strong stories of what really went down in such things as the War of 1812. In my analysis, it seems to be, without going into detail, perhaps it could be said that the Americans were too hot-headed and jumped too quickly to military action when some of their sailors were held captive on the high seas by the British and turned into slaves, basically. Maybe they didn't have to go to war so quickly, but they did. But I think that the British set a trap, and they wanted that war, and they wanted to undo the victories of 1776, utilizing, and again, Canada, Quebec played a very big role. Ontario back then played a very big role in British beachheads in their war against the United States. So for Canadians, this is difficult because we're often told a version of history that's premised fallaciously on the idea that it's all about Canada-U.S. relations. And the idea that Canada has actually been a proxy of the British Empire in their ongoing battle to destroy the United States is completely written out of the acceptable narratives that have been printed in our history books, in the popular literature. So people don't think about it from the proper chemistry of a global process that they could triangulate in on Canada's role within said process. And because of that, they feel a lot of resentment that, the Americans have been trying to take over Canada since 1650, and there's all of these case studies of Americans trying to, indeed, it's true, have war with Canada. That's true, but that's not the full truth, because the full truth is that the Americans didn't see Canada as a sovereign country, which it never has been, but rather an appendage of a broader global British Empire that stretched from India all the way, the sun never set. Right. And it was never simply a national thing. It wasn't a British nation-going empire. It was always a set of mystery cults that utilized certain agencies, like the Hellfire Club being one of many, but also banking networks like the City of London, which back then, as today, is the center of global financial control. Intelligence networks that are very, very sophisticated. It's not a new thing that you have MI6, Five Eyes, GCHQ, CIA, CSIS integration. That's not new. It goes back a long time, though the branding changes in time, but it's the same methods. So when you read again the writings of a lot of the founding fathers, they were much more astute about that. And we've become, I think, a little bit more simplistic, maybe due to Hollywood films that have given us a false sense of simplicity of what motivates nations to do things, what is our history, and we've forgotten what it needs to be done if we're going to fight such an ancient, integrated, centralized, globally extended empire, which has a direct continuous continuity of existence and MO since ancient Babylon to the present, including many of the leading families who didn't change.
It's quite interesting to find out, because in school we don't learn a lot of this at all.
Yeah.
We talk about how Canada was a peaceful country, we're peacekeepers,
Yeah.
and we basically were, just came together. But no, there's a lot of bloodshed that led to Canada as we know it. So now as we're making our way past War of 1812, we get into 1867, where we come together, and it's really the Maritimes, Quebec, and Ontario at this time coming together to create Canada. Can you take us through that part?
Yep. Well, there was already a strong annexation movement because Canada was being suffocated in the... America had more of a battle between the British free trade dynamic that had been brought in through the creation of Wall Street in the early 19th century. This is what Aaron Burr, who killed Hamilton, was a founding father in many ways of what became Wall Street through his creation of the Bank of Manhattan. And this is what created things like Martin Van Buren, who was a personal lawyer of Aaron Burr. Andrew Jackson was also an asset of Aaron Burr during the War of 1812, actually. And during... in America, there's more of an interesting battle between the patriotic Republican faction that were authentic revolutionaries who fought for the right to utilize protectionism, national banking, internal improvements to build a real sovereign nation with a high quality of culture, versus this opposing faction that wanted to stay subjugated, if not politically, then at the very least economically, to the City of London global control mechanism. And that was, again, what the origins of Wall Street were and still are to this very day, is, I would say, a fifth column inside of the United States. So in the U.S., there have been these bursts of vast progress during the times of protective tariffs under John Quincy Adams, when Madison preserved the national bank and applied protective tariffs during the 7 Years' War. The War of 1812. Or even the early precarious first 2 decades. The American population grew in leaps and bounds. They quadrupled their population in the first 40 years. Life expectancy, productive powers increased whenever the protective system that then was known as the American system was applied. Instead of the British free trade, which always tended to open up the door to speculation, open borders that allowed for the private, monopolies to come in and take and subjugate the nation economically whenever that would happen. Whereas in Canada, we only had British free trade that was ever permitted. So we were only allowed to be hewers of wood, drawers of water by the design of London. We weren't allowed to develop manufacturing. And when we had tried, from time to time, Britain would come in, crush our local manufacturing efforts at various moments. And so we remained stifled. Though we were a very large territory, even today you see it, we're 1/10 of the U.S. population, very low development, only like 7 major cities strung up around the U.S. border. So that's not an accident. That's by design, a carefully managed design. And that suffocation resulted in an annexation movement that was then led in the 1840s and 50s by Louis-Joseph Papineau, who had formerly led the rebellion of the Patriots to join the USA. And basically the logic was sound, that we can't survive under this zero growth policy of the empire, but the U.S. at least has a fight to have growth in a legit way. So that was one element of it. The other, I think, again, element of the creation of Confederation was that the British Empire had two simultaneous Confederacy operations to destroy the Union at play at the same time. A Southern Confederation, that was the U.S., the Confederacy, and they had their own constitution to create a special relationship with the British Empire that they wrote a constitution for, which banned forever the abolishment of slavery as an institution. So within their own constitution, people say, oh, slavery would have gone out with time. It's like, no, in the Confederate Constitution of Jefferson Davis, who, by the way, came to Montreal, Canada, en route to England, in that very constitution, it says that any attempt forever to legalize the institution of human slavery will be outlawed in this constitution. It also bans forever the use of internal improvements or protective tariffs within the Constitution. So it was very much based upon an idea of a special relationship with England, that England would essentially create a new slave empire. And there were figures around the figure of, or collaborators around the figure of Albert Pike, who was a Confederate general, high level, who created later on what was known as the KKK after the Civil War was finished. But during that time, he was also a leading member of the Knights of the Golden Circle that had about 80,000 members strong during the 1850s. And the Knights of the Golden Circle had a whole program to expand slavery after declaring independence from the United States and expand the slave system to encapsulate basically a new empire that would take control of most of Central America, a big chunk of South America, and it would have, ironically, Cuba as their capital. And they have graphs that they made, and it's what it's called the Golden Circle. And the KKK, Ku Klux is Greek for the circle, and that was a direct reference to the earlier Knights of the Golden Circle Empire that was attempted by Judah Benjamin, a leading figure of the B'nai B'rith, as well, which was created in 1851 as a new sort of Freemasonic society that would work very closely with the British in America. Still a big problem today in many ways, which we don't have to go into right now. But all of that to say, that failed because people were a lot wiser around the Lincoln Network than many historians give them credit for, and were able to navigate that minefield. But only one of the two confederacies failed. The other one succeeded. And that was, unfortunately, the British Northern Confederacy that did so much work to run the Albany raids. Terrorist actions against Lincoln during the Civil War were run from Kingston, from Toronto, from Montreal. I mentioned earlier the murder of Lincoln himself was managed by handlers through St. Lawrence Hall, which is just down the street here in Montreal, which was the Confederate hub that John Wilkes Booth stayed at for 5 weeks. He described how he didn't have any strong recollections of what happened to him, to a letter to a family member that had been preserved, but he did have a strong impulse to murder Lincoln, and he wasn't alone. He was in his hostel where he was staying. There was actually a $500 banknote by Henry Starnes, the president of the Bank of Ontario, that had been given to him, who was later on rewarded by being made mayor of Montreal in 1865. So you had this whole insidious Freemasonic network managing the shadow government and a lot of these dark, like deep state operations back then. And Canada was a hub, so it was only when it was becoming recognized, I think, by the British Empire that their plan to break up the Union and undo 1776 was going to fail, that they sanctioned a certain meeting to draft what became the British North America Act. That meeting was not 1867. 1867 was the passage of the Act in London. It was 1864, while the Civil War was still winding down, that the actual booze-soaked 1 month long sort of party occurred in the Maritimes that brought together the different founding fathers of Canada that drafted the wording itself. So that was already being done because they realized that they were going to definitely lose Canada if you had a strong America emerge and the world was awakening fast to the nefariousness of British intrigue. I mean, the British had a very bad name, right? They'd been caught working to destroy Russia through the Crimean War, which was a trap set by the French, the British, and the Ottomans to enmesh Russia in the 1853 to 56 period. That was a complete spider's web trap. Russia was that's part of the reason why Alexander II was able to take power with greater wisdom of the nature of these enemy operations. The man who saved Lincoln's Union. But also the Opium Wars was also very disgusting, that Britain was known as the dominant global drug runner of the world that had gone to war to destroy China by when they said no to bringing in British-run opium. And they'd carried out the massacre of over 20 million Indians who had tried to carry out rebellions against British enforcement of an empire policy over India by the 1858-60 period. So everyone was beginning to realize that the British Empire was not this free-loving, liberal type of identity that they'd put out as their branding, but had this other dark force tied to it. And I think that Britain knew that they were going to lose Canada, and so they worked very hard to accelerate the creation of a confederation that would be locked in to, as our own Constitution literally says, to create a new type of nation in order to promote the interests of the British Empire, which it literally says in the BNA Act right up front. And enmesh things like the Privy Council office, the Privy Council itself, the Governor Generals, Lieutenant Governors, into managerial positions of a real power that most Canadians have no idea how this works. And including political science professors I've spoken to have no clear idea how this works. But it's quite a stroke of evil brilliance in some ways, I gotta say.
By design, like you said earlier.
Yeah.
Rupert's Land, the purchase of, and then Alberta in 1905 becoming part of this empire of Britain. How did that come to pass?
Well, Rupert's Land was set up in the 1670s, 1672, I think, as a land that would be run as sort of an appendage of the British East India Company, a private land devoted purely to fur trapping, pretty much. So that was the dominant economy, and so furs was the dominant product we would outsource, or not outsource, but sell to the external world. And for about 2 centuries, it was a no man's land. Like, you had to have a specific license by the Hudson's Bay Company in order to be permitted to even travel on the land. It seems like there's evidence that Jesuit infiltration of various native bands was able to weaponize certain groups that would even headhunt people walking on that land that didn't have the protection of a Hudson's Bay certificate saying that they have a right to be there. So there was a high degree of effort to keep that uninhabited, underdeveloped, and possibly used for social engineering experiments, but that's personally my just hypothesis. But that became inhibitory when it was recognized again by the empire that this entire northern part of the continent was in danger of being taken from them. And so they accelerated in 1867 to 69 the sale of Rupert's Land to Canada for pennies on the dollar. And that made it at least easier for Johnny MacDonald, who said, remember, that I would leave Canada a barren wasteland for the next generations, except that I know if we don't go there, the Yankees will. He's talking about the national policy of 1870 to 1885. And that national policy was based on a bribe. Just like the British had bribed the Quebecois in 1774, so too did they offer a bribe to British Columbians who had pioneered and created sort of an isolated colony of British Columbia. It was isolated from the East Coast by far, right? There was no connection, no rail, no commerce with the Empire or with the East. The only commerce they had was with San Francisco. So you had a very robust movement for annexation of British Columbia back then, very robust. Ulysses S. Grant, the president of 1870 onward, even gave his support, saying, look, this should be American policy, is to support the annexation movement. And they had a governor named Frederick Seymour, who was a pretty good guy. He was an Irish guy, didn't have any love for the empire, but for some reason, he found himself as the governor, the British governor of British Columbia. And he was caught protecting the annexation movement and buying them time to negotiate and set the stage. So it was only when he was eliminated, he was basically, he comes up in my book series quite a bit, and it seems like he was sent on a fool's venture to try to resolve some dispute with Inuits, and ended up dead quickly. And immediately, as soon as his body is brought back, Johnny MacDonald is happy. He actually inserts one of his assistants to become the new governor of British Columbia, Cosimo de Damore. Strange name. And he just expedites BC's entry into Confederation in 1870 really fast, streamlined. And the annexation movement, which represents the majority of people of BC, are very pissed. But with that, the British Empire pays off BC's terrible debts. Their debts are paid off. They're promised a rail line finally. It takes 15 years, but the promise begins. A few other local freedoms are permitted. And because you've sort of nationalized Rupert's Land, Hudson's Bay, it also facilitates the bureaucracy a little bit more. And so some of those territories are carved out over the next decades into Saskatchewan, Alberta. The Red River Colony becomes increasingly Manitoba. But again, there's always this anxiety amongst the imperialists that the West Coast, which hosts some of the most bountiful resources and also has a culture of pioneering, right? A more independence-minded culture, because you've gone into the frontiers. You've had to build up resources from your own creative powers. That shapes and uplifts people's sense of cultural confidence. That is a danger for control freaks, of which the empire has always been. And they've, I think, always had a high priority of trying to find ways to create a chokehold, a stranglehold, to keep that area of the west of Canada at bay, knowing that if they allow the chains to get too loose, that it would be very easy for the spirit of the people to arise and demand the control of their own economic destiny. And we've seen that, again, periodically reproduce itself throughout our history, throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It's been a theme.
I'm glad you went there, because some of my last questions to you is, how do we get to equalization? And this is exactly how we got to equalization, is when Alberta joined, 1905. Shortly after that, oil is discovered. And there you go. The resources are very rich, and the East doesn't want the West to go ahead and loosen those chains. Mm-hmm. So here comes something we call the equalization.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that the empire is really good at, creating divided and more easily conquered systems, right? And that's been always the tool from ancient Babylon to today, is you divide to conquer. And Canada has been wired in such a very devious manner. It's extremely devious that that the empire never permitted, from our very origins, free trade amongst the provinces, in order to better keep our culture, our national identity, as broken up and isolated to local regions as possible, with no connection. Whereas in America, people have historically had a very different idea, because the American states have had the benefit of free trade amongst themselves. They've been able to develop a whole unified identity, even though one could say in recent years that's taken a big hit. But historically, that's been the general trend. Now, the good part of that, and that's part of the BNA Act, is that it allocates an immense amount of power to the provinces to control their own economic destiny in Section 92. Other places too. It allows the provinces to control immense amount of their destiny over what they do with their resources, how they apply their education policy, other things, which, when you have had authentic, freedom-oriented leaders and a culture that was able to select from amongst itself and give support to said leaders. In the case of W.A.C. Bennett, that's one great example of a premier who is of that sort of character, who was able to utilize those powers to say, okay, if Ottawa is going to sabotage what we're trying to do with a vision, because he had a vision to build up the north of BC, build up the Peace River hydroelectric dams, to work with John F. Kennedy to build up the hydroelectric potential in the Kootenay in the south, as well as rail lines galore. He had a vision to connect rail all the way up, to open up not just resources, but to connect into even Alaska, which was a big project that he had put forth, and it began even, but it was sabotaged. But he didn't do any of this because of Ottawa, but always in spite of. And always you had the civil service embedded within the deep state in Ottawa, always trying to sabotage, constrict capital from the provinces that at different times had these visionary leaders. So same thing for Quebec. It's incredible to see how the story of, we know we have a lot of hydroelectric power, 95% of our electricity comes from hydro. That wasn't done because of Ottawa. That was always done because you had the Union National Government, people who said, okay, we're trying to work with Ottawa, but they're preventing it, they're constricting, so let's do it ourselves. And oftentimes it was not just going solo. It was because you had BC, WAC Bennett's BC offering a $100 million loan to Quebec outside of Ottawa to permit Quebec to build the James Bay development corridors and a lot of these other things. So that's, again, another part of our history that's been almost written completely out of existence. And in that context, if you had that spirit, there never would have been the need for any equalization payments, because that just creates hostility between, number one, it's a patch to an artificial dysfunction that you've built into the system. Number one, by creating a nation that would be divided amongst itself. And number two, sabotaging the ability of those different parts to have full spectrum functional economies that wouldn't need equalization handouts from another province. You wouldn't have to do that. So, and that's what they largely did, is they sabotaged the different efforts to have a full spectrum industrial economy, the likes of which people like Daniel Johnson, our premier, had envisioned in the 1960s and 50s, who died a very strange death in 1969. Same thing for, Alberta. Alberta had all of this potential to have full-blown advanced manufacturing, and at different times it came close in the 70s. There was more than there is today, but there was an intentional dismantling of manufacturing so that these parts of Canada would only be allowed to be resource extractors, hewers of wood, drawers of water. That same policy from the 1760s was still maintained, except with 21st century features, but still the same thing. And then, as such, we crippled the economy of Quebec. They did certain things that forced Quebec to sell its electricity to the United States at a much, much cheaper rate because of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Then it would cost a Quebecois purchaser of Quebec Hydro to purchase or to sell to Ontario. It would cost an Ontarian purchaser of Quebec Hydro 4 or 5 times more than it would for a New York purchaser of the hydro. So you're selling it at an unbearably low cost. You're not permitting Quebec to develop its industries. You're keeping it a consumer society wasteland. And so it's got a huge budget, again, unnecessary. There's no need for this level of, you can cut 95% of the bureaucracy out of the state and still have a functional, probably a more functional society, I would say. And the same could be said probably for Alberta. But you create this giant overburdened incompetence machine that can't survive on its own, so then you could just steal it from Alberta. And then you create, again, more hostility where the Albertans hate the Quebecois don't know what the hell's going on. And the nation is, again, perfectly divided and thus more easy to manage.
There's that division you're talking about. You got the haves and have-nots, the East and the West, and this is something we have been hearing about a lot as we're growing up here in Canada. And you're right, the Alberta and Quebec relationship has been very difficult until they met in Ottawa and realized we're not so different.
Yeah.
My final question to you, because I could do 2 episodes with you. My final question to you on this one is, how does Alberta get out of this? Is this movement have enough steam? Do you think this is the coming together of enough of the mechanisms to go ahead and break that chain finally?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I've been down now on 4 occasions speaking to a lot of town hall meetings and a lot of people. There's definitely, it's the most robust signs of life that I see anywhere in Canada is located there in Alberta. I think that, and I was speaking to a strategic analyst who lives in Calgary, who's very smart, and he was sharing some of his concerns with me that I believe he's correct, is that there's a certain, well, there's 2 things. One, there's a tendency, and that's expected, to be naive about what is going on in the world more broadly. So there's a tendency to just see things as Alberta, a myopic idea of Alberta without an appreciation for some of the battle lines and the minefield that's being shaped by forces and factors far beyond that particular province. And there's an over-catering to the rural demographic. And for sure, the Alberta Prosperity Project is robust. It's exciting, hugely in favor of separation, which is great. Like you mentioned, this stat was like 67% surveyed. Great. But the urbans are not, and this person lives in urban Calgary. The younger demographics are not really being represented. And he showed me like a picture of the leadership of the Alberta Prosperity Project. And, he's like five older white guys with cowboy hats, and it's very difficult for, even though it would be sellable, it's something that you could definitely educate the younger demographics to support within the urban areas, there's no effort being made. There's kind of a disdain for the idea that the youth living in urban areas are just a lost cause. Forget about them and just focus on the cowboys. Focus on the people who have the get up and go and the good old Christian morality. And it's from a tactical level a mistake, that an opportunity he thinks that's being missed in not expanding an effort to really mobilize an educational process and work in the urban areas of Edmonton and Calgary. And I tend to, again, I'm sympathetic with that. The other thing I would say, and I left this as an open thing during my last speech last week at the Courage to Listen event, whether or not that it's chosen more wise, that it's going to be more wise to go for full independence quickly, or maybe wait to build up the consensus, because right now it's uncertain whether or not, if they call it, in a couple of months, is there enough people so far to really go to do it? Because if you screw it up now, you won't get a second chance. Or should you wait a little bit longer and build more of a consensus so that when the vote happens, you really get a landslide? Because there will be saboteurs within the civil service who will work to undermine that. But I would be very sympathetic. I think that Alberta definitely has the means to build up its own nation. It definitely has the economic means, the cultural means. But I also said, if you choose that, you want to go the Daniel Smith approach, that might be viable if you're really prepared for a fight. Because there's, as I mentioned, a huge amount of authority within the Westminster system, which I'm not a fan of. But still, there's a huge amount of authority to simply say we want to renegotiate the equalization payments. We don't want to do that anymore. And you can force that renegotiation. You can force all sorts of provincial controls over what you choose to do. My concern as well, so that could be a path they might want to take, and then force Ottawa, like say, okay, here are our conditions. If you don't meet these conditions, then Carney will have a choice to say, okay, we're going to satisfy those conditions, or we're not going to. We're going to, and if they don't and show bad faith, then that will probably take a lot of people who are on the edge, saying like, I don't know if I really want to separate. That might push them. That would definitely push a huge demographic towards saying, okay, separation, we tried the best as we could. The other thing, though, that concerns me is I believe that Carney is preparing, just like Mario Draghi and the militarists in Europe, even though he's intellectually committed to what he outlines in his book Values, which is a zero-growth eco-economy or eco-world founded upon no development, carbon capture, other things that are going to be antagonistic to the aspirations of citizens to improve their lives and their kids' lives. He's committed to that, just as Draghi and the technocrats of Europe are. But at the same time, they're in this weird position where there's a decision to realign global systems right now underway. And a lot of it's being driven by a need to destroy Russia and also its ally China and other allies who are part of what some call the multipolar alliance, but it has different names. But it's basically a bunch of civilizational states that don't want to commit mass suicide. That's basically what unites them. They want to go for development. They don't want to have mass suicide under some green eco Gaia mass sacrifice. So because they're not playing the New World Order ball game, they have to be destroyed. The problem is we spent the last 50 years destroying our economy, making our people stupider, and not being able to actually fight economically with countries that are doing what Eurasia is doing. So a decision has been made, and Carney is, I think, assigned to play a certain role to walk this weird balancing act of pushing for a military industrialized economy that might involve certain bribes to Alberta. I wouldn't be surprised if he allows for a burst of economic activity as a partial bribe to shut up and to undermine the Alberta independence movement, but also to industrialize in a way which doesn't, he just signed a protocol to join the European Union on June 23rd. Not full join, but it's a European Integration Act that also ties us into the Rearm Europe program, as well as the European Defense Bank. So he's very much committed. There's even discussions of conscription, as there is in Europe, underway right now. So they want to have a certain type of disgusting wartime industrialization which will benefit the average citizen the least possible. So they have an idea of maybe looking at, not maybe, definitely looking at Alberta for all of the resources that would be needed for the military buildup, but they want to be able to put a cap on it in the same way that Johnny MacDonald had the intention of allowing for an industrial burst, with the intention of being able to put a cap on it, put the genie back in the bottle in the next generation or two. So that's sort of what I would see as a danger that I would warn Albertans to not succumb to, because they might find it's just easier to not have that fight and to not have that discussion. Instead, just accept maybe being allowed to have some pipelines. He might allow it. He might allow the Canadian infrastructure development. He just passed something called the Bill C-5, the One Canada Act. It's the most omnibus bill we've ever seen that for the first time ever ends all of the barriers on interprovincial free trade. It's now over. It was just given royal assent on June 26th for the first time. I think that's part of a general policy to create a bigger, consolidated command and control of Canada to wield our resources in wartime, but with the idea that if they can destroy Russia and China, undermine them in any way under some Orwellian sort of resculpted world order, then they will be able to then finally just put the clamp down and start the depopulation type of program on their terms. So that's something which I was warning as many people I could to look into, to think about as they go about their planning.
Wow. Thank you very much for your time today. That's
Sure.
a lot of information. I'm definitely going to have another conversation with you
Sure.
as we see if some of this comes to fruition, especially with Bill C-5 now that just passed, and where we're headed with Carney. Thank
Sure.
you very much for your time, Matt.
Of course.
Well, from Babylon to British Columbia, this has been a design. And the British Empire has been really, really strong at making sure that we divide and we don't focus on breaking those chains. As Matt laid out here, our future is not certain. We absolutely should take a look at this, making sure that our people and young people do not end up in a war in Europe. That might be the one straw that breaks the camel's back and get the young people to the table, because Alberta is definitely able to take care of itself, does not need the rest of Canada anymore, and maybe it's time for Canada to realize that. Well, thank you very much for Matt's time, Alberta. I hope you learned something today. I sure did. And make sure you stay tuned for the rest of the episodes, because Ben Trudeau is going to be one of our guests on the show as well. So we'll be expanding from the Alberta's perspective as well, from some of this history. So thank you very much for your time. Take care of each other, and God bless.